Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Conjunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link from my book where I teach you how to do magic and live responsibly, and the links to get in contact with me or directly support the channel so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the Mysterium Conjunctionis with the last section of Chapter 5. We may get the epilogue done today. It depends upon time. Let's dig in. Actually, let's take that up one more notch and get that centered for y'all real quick. All right. As I have repeatedly pointed out, the alchemist statements about the lapis, considered psychologically, describe the archetype of the self. Its phenomenology is exemplified in mandala symbolism, which portrays itself as concentric structure, often in the form of a squaring of the circle. Coordinated with this are all kinds of secondary symbols, most of them expressing the nature of the opposites to be united. The structure is invariably felt as the representation of a central state, or of a center of personality essentially different from the ego. It is of numinous nature, as is clearly indicated by the mandalas themselves and by the symbols used: sun, star, light, fire, flower, precious stone, etc. All degrees of emotional evaluation are found, from abstract, colorless, indifferent drawings of circles to an extremely intense experience of illumination. These aspects all appear in alchemy, the only difference being that they are projected into matter, whereas here they are understood as symbols. The arcanum chemicum has therefore changed into a psychic event without having lost any of its original numinosity. We'll pause briefly just to point out, as we have all the way through this, is that Jung, while he was very interested in this, never completed the work himself. He never made the final step that would have got him all of these things that he's talking about. He has an inferior understanding of what is going on. A lot of that is due to the source material, as we will discover as we go through the theatrum. There are a lot of misdesignations, right? It was a common misconception to get spirit and soul confused. For instance, spirit is the thing that allows it to happen. Soul is the part that makes the decisions. That is somewhat interchangeable as you go through alchemy. The clear definition of terms is not something that is really existent. There is a lot of contradictions along the way. The only real way to get there is to physically do it yourself, and by physically I mean entirely internal. Right? There is physical alchemy outside of yourself, and there is mental alchemy inside of yourself. Most, it appears, from this study, right? We will be getting into more alchemy in a minute, but from this study, it appears that most of the references to the external was really just a reference to the internal. Yes, they were doing experimentation. Yes, they were even looking for things, but they never really were able to create a philosopher's stone outside of themselves. But a few of them were able to do it within themselves. Dorn being one of the most notable examples that stands out. The reason why we're going to the theatricum chemicum next. There's a lot of terminology problems, and a lot of that was Jung's problem, but in addition to that was his refusal to let go completely of the control system that he was reared in. Right? His background was Catholic. The Catholic Church is extremely overbearing, with a lot of really, really bad doctrine. Right? I tell you all of the time that you get to make your own decisions, that you are here for your experience, not for mine, and that in the choices that you make are valid for your experience. I tell you all of the time that you are able to pursue your religious interest in the way that you would like. There are many things that I don't recommend, however, right? I do not recommend that you follow Aleister Crowley at all. Blood sacrifice, sex magic, all of that is really bad, right? The same with Eliphas Levi. I believe that Eliphas Levi was a agent of the Catholic Church and for disinformation. You should not listen. Who else we got? We got Cornelius Agrippa, completely ignorant of anything that he was talking about. Right? There are a lot of problems, but Jung was not able to let go of the restrictions of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a lot, like, that's where I was going with it. I do not recommend that you listen to those three people at all, right? There is very little of value that can be extracted from any of their works. The same is true for pretty much the entirety of Catholic doctrine altogether. It is intrinsically opposite to the enlightenment of the soul. It is intrinsically opposite to self-regulation. It is intrinsically opposite to self-responsibility. It is diametrically opposed to the truth in a lot of ways. And so I do not recommend the Catholic Church in particular, right? There are a lot of religions that I'm like, yeah, it's kind of ambivalent, right? The difference between Pentecostals and Baptists, there is a big difference. And the legality in those, it's a problem. But at least they're trying, honestly, to get you to where you need to go. I do not feel that way at all about the Catholic Church. There may be some good individuals within, and there absolutely is, right? Your average parishioner, for example. But when you get into the clergy, and you get into the liturgy, and you get into the doctrines, I am completely diametrically opposed to almost every single thing that they stand for, which is, by the way, opposite of the teachings of Jesus. I believe that'll set the background well enough going forward. And so he is talking about things in the understanding that he has, but he did not achieve the final product. I have, right? And final is a big word, right? That is a continuous refinement process. But I have produced the Philosopher's Stone. It is your heart. I have outlined the steps by which you can do so as well. It is up to you if you choose to pursue. I do not say that this is the only way, but I do say that it is a way. Back to the text. If we now recall to what a degree the soul has humanized and realized itself, we can judge how very much it today expresses the body also, with which it is coexistent. Here is a conjunctio of the second degree, such as the alchemist had most dreamed of, but could not realize. Thus far, the transformation into the psychological is a notable advance, but only if the center experience proves to be a spiritus rector of daily life. Obviously, it was clear, even to the alchemist, that one could have a lapis in one's pocket without ever making gold with it, or the aurum potibile in a bottle without ever having tasted the bittersweet drink. Hypothetically speaking, of course, for they never succumbed to the temptation to use their stone in reality because they never succeeded in making one. And see, that is the problem, right? That is one of the key problems. At least a few of them did. Dorn, I have no doubt, right? We are going to get into it, and I can be proven wrong. But from what we have seen from this study, Dorn knew what he was talking about. Dorn actually did complete the process. But the completion of the process is not creating a physical philosopher's stone. It is creating an internal one. And they did that. Jung does not want to admit that, would probably be the best way, because he is looking at it through the lens of psychology. And while that is perfectly fine, there's not a whole lot of difference, right? The terminology is a little bit different. The definitions are a little bit different. But the work really isn't, right? The work is basically the same. And that was his problem. That is why he didn't complete the work, right? He was looking at it through the lens of psychology, and that is fine. You can achieve results that way. But it won't be the results. It won't be the final, right? The ability to heal yourself, to manifest outside of yourself with energetic manifestations. That he couldn't get. But Dorn did, right? The definitions are the real hang-up for him here, right? He is looking for the chemical side of it when it is mostly about the spiritual side of it, Right? I say mostly. That is my designation for it from the limited experience that we have had so far. We will be diving a lot deeper into the alchemy, but it is with the caveat that most of it is going to be talking about the reflection. Right? The shadow work is an intrinsic part of the alchemic process. It is the method by which you create that philosopher's stone. It is the same as going to therapy for the most part. Right? You are going in, identifying within yourself the things that need to change that you are not even really conscious of. It's basically the exact same thing. The only difference is alchemy relies upon you taking the steps, or if you have a mentor, that mentor helping you to take the steps, whereas psychology is more of someone showing you the steps to take. It's a little bit of a difference, like not a whole lot. It's very pedantic of an argument, but that is why he was never able to complete the Philosopher's Stone for himself. It's why he never had the throne room experience. It is never why he was never able to do the manifestation parts. I mean, it was the failure to commit. That is a large part of it, and I suspect that was the major stone for the Catholic Church in particular. That stone is a difficult one. The submittal of your will to God's will is a big thing, and if you believe that there has to be an intermediary between there, it's not going to be possible for you to submit in the right way. It's just not. All right. The psychological significance of this misfortune should not be overestimated. However, it takes second place in comparison with the fascination which emanated from the sensed and intuited archetype of wholeness. In this respect, alchemy fared no worse than Christianity, which in its turn was not fatally disturbed by the continuing non-appearance of the Lord at the second coming. Let's let that sit for just a second. Just a second, right? It's just for a second. Yeah, buddy. In this respect, alchemy fared no worse than Christianity, which, in its turn, was not fatally disturbed by the continuing non-appearance of the Lord at the second coming. That is vitally important. There are people waiting on this today, right? Jesus is not coming back. There is an event that is coming. It is probably will be considered a judgment, although it is almost certainly not. It is on a timetable. There will be death. There will be destruction. There will be a lot of things. See the 12,000-year disaster cycle. But it won't be Jesus, right? That is a complete misinterpretation of a lot of things. One of them is that Jesus said no one in this generation will die before, or this generation will not pass away, which means that all of you won't. I mean, some people will. People die every day. But this generation will not pass before you see these things unfolding. That was a big statement, and it did not come true. If we look back in Isaiah, for instance, there is a prophecy that is given that says, hey, king, you tell me what you want the prophecy to be. And the king's like, whoa, no, buddy, I ain't doing that shit. So Isaiah said, fine, I will give you one. And he said, hey, you see this chick right here? This chick right here, this maiden right here. She's going to get pregnant and give birth. And before the child is old enough to eat cheese, the Babylonians are going to come and they're going to take you into captivity. This child, his name will be Emmanuel, right? And then, in order to ensure that this happened, he impregnated that chick, right? He got her pregnant with the child named Emmanuel, and the child was born, and before he was eating cheese, Babylon came in and took them off. That was a prophecy given. That was a prophecy fulfilled exactly in the way that the prophecy was given, with no caveats that later on it would mean something different. That is a big deal, right? That was the presage to the first coming of Christ, and yet there is no virgin birth contained within that prophecy whatsoever. And in addition to that, it played out exactly as it was supposed to, down to the return. Everything played out exactly as it was prophesied. That is prophecy given, prophecy fulfilled. There was a prophecy Jesus gave that said, before this generation dies, I shall return. Paraphrasing. And it did not happen. And so what had happened? Christianity is like, well, he meant later. That's literally what they say. They said, oh, he means later, down the road, sometime in the future. We're 2025 years down the road, right? There is no sign. There is no imminence. It is not happening. As a matter of fact, all of the things that are prophesied to happen at his return, they're all contained in the 12,000-year disaster cycle. They have happened before. They will happen again. And it has absolutely nothing to do with this particular person being your redeemer. That is a not thing, right? That is nothing. That is non-existent. No one else can take the place of your sin. There was never, at any point in time, the ability for a sacrifice of blood to take away your sin. As a matter of fact, the sacrifice of blood is somewhat abominable in the eyes of the true Lord. And so there's a lot of problems, and if any of that is confusing to you, fall back to the relevant parts of the Bible study. It is linked in the top. It is an unconventional Bible study. Go to Isaiah, read about Isaiah, listen to me read Isaiah to you, however you want to do it. You can go to John and see what the prophecy was and see if it was fulfilled. Check it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Go back to the source material. Go read the book. There's a lot in there that you probably do not understand. The second coming, indeed. The intense emotion that is always associated with the vitality of an archetypal idea conveys, even though only a minimum of rational understanding may be present, a premonitory experience of wholeness to which a subsequently differentiated understanding can add nothing essential, at least as regards the totality of the experience. A better developed understanding can, however, constantly renew the vitality of the original experience. Agreed. In view of the inexhaustibility of the archetype, the rational understanding derived from it means relatively little, and it would be an unjustifiable overestimation of reason to assume that, as a result of understanding, the illumination in the final state is a higher one than in the initial state of numinous experience. The same objection, as we have seen, was made to Cardinal Newman's view concerning the development of dogma. But it was overlooked that rational understanding or intellectual formulation adds nothing to the experience of wholeness, and at best only facilitates its repetition. It was overlooked that rational understanding or intellectual formulation adds nothing to the experience of wholeness. I do not believe that at all, right? I experience the wholeness, right? That is the meditative experience in part, right? That may not be what he's talking about in here, right? But it should be. A rational understanding of the spiritual process to me is an intrinsic part of this that is inseparable, right? There is the experience, and then there is what you take from the experience. What you take from the experience is how you rationalize it. It is how you go through and understand it. You should be doing that. And the experience itself is the important thing, not its intellectual representation or clarification. I am in complete disagreement with that. The intellectual representation and clarification is the entire point of the experience. There is no reason to have the experience if it does not bring about clarification at all. Not its intellectual representation or clarification, which proves meaningful and helpful only when the road to the original experience is blocked. You cannot go back to an original experience, right? That is a thing, right? No man enters the same river twice because both the river and the man are different. No one can go back to an original experience. Once you have had it, it is blocked. It is literally that simple, right? Even a repetition of the same experience is not the same experience. The differentiation of dogma not only expresses its vitality, but is needed in order to preserve its vitality. Similarly, the archetype at the basis of alchemy needs interpreting if we are to form any conception of its vitality and numinosity, and thereby preserve it, at least for our science. The alchemist likewise interpreted his experience as best he could, though without ever understanding it to the degree that psychological explanation makes possible today. That is an assumption. Dorn proves that assumption to not be necessarily correct. Now, does that mean that they defined it in scientific, psychological terms? No. But did he go through the process? Yes. But his inadequate understanding did not detract from the totality of his archetypal experience any more than our wider and more differentiated understanding adds anything to it. See, that the problem is that you assume that your understanding is wider, and in some cases it is, right? Paracelsus didn't know what he was talking about. For the most part, he was wrong, right? Dorn, however, did, and that is how it appears from this particular study. There are many assumptions that we make, right? There are many assumptions that we make that are not necessarily true, and this is one of them. But the assumption that God looks like us, that is an assumption that there is no foundational basis for. That he thinks like us, acts like us, understands like us, completely illogical. It does not make any sense. It is just your pride that makes that a thing. That your particular dogma that you grew up in, that's the right one. Everybody else is absolutely wrong, right? That is a bad understanding of things. We can come to better understandings through reflection and review. That is the process, right? Just because someone wasn't able to define something in a way that we can now does not mean that they were wrong, right? Plato was talking about molecular biology and chemistry well before there was any way to talk about those things in scientific terms. Fall back to the Ancient Lore playlist or Plato's playlist where we talk about that. He quite literally described elements, atoms, the way that they combine even. It was a wonderful thing to look at, and it was pre-existent to any scientific understanding whatsoever. It is not, for some reason, related to alchemy that much, right? We haven't seen a whole lot of Plato references in here. That is wild to me because he was talking about this prior to anyone else that I'm aware of. But we come to a greater understanding as we go along, right? We are able now to define the elements, right? We have the periodic table. We have an understanding of how they combine into molecules and mixtures, or into compounds and mixtures. Molecules are the things that do that. We have a better understanding and we're better able to define it now, but that does not mean that he did not have some understanding that allowed him a greater understanding than other people. I mean, his understanding of chemistry and our understanding of chemistry are not the same, but they're foundationally the same. They are really foundationally the same. Again, fall back to the study. My main point right here is to point out that this is an assumption that is being made. You are assuming that because you were able to better technically define terms that you have a better experience. But you didn't. You didn't complete the process. You did not get the final result. You did not create the Philosopher's Stone for yourself. You didn't even have the understanding, really, that it was possible. That is an issue. Be careful with the assumptions that you make. You should look back and see, am I making this assumption based upon reality or upon a pre-existent understanding, right? Breaking loose from your control system that you were reared in can be an exceedingly difficult thing. The things that we talked about, the assuming that God looks like you, being an assumption, right? There is nobody that has ever looked God in his eyes. You may have had a spiritual experience where you think that you did. That was a spiritual experience. It was not physical corporeality. You did not look into the eyes of God. If you looked into the eyes of something claiming to be God, that was an entity, and you should be exceedingly careful when dealing with it. See the covenant in Exodus for that one. With the advance towards the psychological, a great change sets in, for self-knowledge has certain ethical consequences which are not just impassively recognized, but demand to be carried out in practice. That is true with spiritual alchemy and psychology, right? They're really the same thing. This depends on, of course, on one's own moral endowment, on which, as we know, one should not place too much reliance. Hear, hear. Right? You cannot place too much reliance upon your moral endowment until you have done the self-reflection to understand where you are falling short in that particular area. Everyone is. It is not just you. And if you think it is not you, you are incorrect. The self, in its efforts at self-realization, reaches out beyond the ego personality on all sides. Because of its all-encompassing nature, it is brighter and darker than the ego, and accordingly confronts it with problems which it would like to avoid. Either one's moral courage fails, or one's insight, or both, until in the end, fate decides. The ego never lacks moral and rational counter-arguments, which one cannot and should not set aside so long as it is possible to hold on to them. That is, that voice talking to you. For the analogy of the pen, there are two voices that you hear. Be careful which one you feed. For you only feel yourself on the right road when you have conflicts of duty seem to have resolved themselves, and you have become the victim of a decision made over your head, or in defiance of the heart. From this, we can see the numinous power of the self, which can hardly be experienced in any other way. For this reason, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. That is mostly true. The extraordinary difficulty in this experience is that the self can be distinguished only conceptually from what has always been referred to as God, but not practically. Again, we bring up the pen, right? There is the ego, the part that is differentiated from God, assigned to your 5D navigation device, which is a temple, right? And then we say that that's this end. And then on this end, there is God. You are the individualized piece of God that has been assigned to your 5D navigation device. Inseparable from the divine source, but not the divine source in its totality, right? Instead, a little bitty sliver of it, here in the mortal coil. These voices on the other side, the positive and the negative, they are both God. God does not just tell you the right thing to do, He is also the tempter. That is the spirit, right? The finiteness of God. He limited Himself into the creation, becoming the creation. And He gives you advice, tells you, hey, you should do this, you should not do this. And then you, as the ego, the self, the same thing, make the decision about that particular situation. Either to listen to the voice or not to. It is your choice and your experience. There are two voices. One is going to tell you the right thing. One is going to tell you the wrong thing. You have to be discerning in which one you listen to. And so the experience that is the self is the ego. It is not different at all. So the experience of the self, when I said mostly true, is not a defeat of the ego, right? But the experience of the self leads to you getting a better understanding of your ego. It leads to you understanding your motivations on why you do things. In order to change those things, you have to understand those things. And so that understanding that leads to the change that you, the self, wants to see in your own life can be considered a defeat of the ego, right? The ego, in that instance, being the unregulated desires of the self. Back to the text. Both concepts apparently rest on an identical numinous factor, which is a condition of reality. The ego enters into the picture only so far as it can offer resistance, defend itself, and in the event of defeat, still affirm its existence. The prototype of this situation is Job's encounter with Yahweh. There is a lot to be pulled from the book of Job. It is in the Bible study, the unconventional Bible study, and you are more than welcome to check it out. It almost certainly does not belong in the Jewish Bible. This hint is intended only to give some indication of the nature of the problems involved. From this general statement, one should not draw the over-hasty conclusion that in every case there is a hybris of ego consciousness, which fully deserves to be overpowered by the unconscious. That is not so at all, because it very often happens that ego consciousness and the ego's sense of responsibility are too weak and need, if anything, strengthening. But these are questions of practical psychotherapy, and I mention them here only because I have been accused of underestimating the importance of the ego and giving undue prominence to the unconscious. Right? The ego and the unconscious are merely two sides of the same coin. The unconscious does rule most of your life if you are not consciously changing that. Again, with the same pen analogy, there is the self and there is the spirit, there is the conscious and there is the unconscious. Exact same things. For the most part, most people only use a little bit of their ego consciousness, and most of their decisions rest upon the unconscious. Through the steps outlined in this book and the various things that we have talked about in this study, you can take control of that consciousness and drive it farther into your unconscious. By doing the self-reflection and the shadow work, you become more conscious more often. You will never attain full consciousness because there is always the divine element that is outside of your control, that is outside of your understanding. We do have that spiritual amnesia. But you can take a great deal of control. Until you have taken a great deal of control, there is a reason for giving prominence to the unconscious. Right? It rules most of your decisions. Whenever you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and you get angry, that is your unconscious making your decision for you. Whenever you are greedy or lustful, that is your unconscious making those decisions for you. You can take those decisions from the unconscious, but it requires you to physically, actively do so. Back to the text. This strange insinuation emanates from a theological quarter. Here we go. Obviously, my critic has failed to realize that the mystical experiences of the saints are no different from the other effects of the unconscious. Agreed. In contrast to the ideal of alchemy, which consisted in the production of a mysterious substance, a man, an anima mundi or a deus tyrannus, who was expected to be a savior from all human ills, the psychological interpretation, foreshadowed by the alchemist, point to the concept of human wholeness. This concept has primarily a therapeutic significance in that it attempts to portray the psychic state which results from bridging over a dissociation between conscious and unconscious. The alchemical compensation corresponds to the integration of the unconscious with consciousness, whereby both are altered. Above all, consciousness experiences a widening of its horizon. This certainly brings about a considerable improvement of the whole psychic situation, since the disturbance of consciousness by the counteraction of the unconscious is eliminated. But because all good things must be paid for dearly, the previous unconscious conflict is brought to the surface instead and imposes on consciousness a heavy responsibility, as it, consciousness, is now expected to solve the conflict. That is the process that I was just talking about. But it seems as badly equipped and prepared for this as was the consciousness of the medieval alchemist. Like him, the modern man needs a special method for investigating and giving shape to the unconscious contents in order to get consciousness out of its fix. As I have shown elsewhere, then experience of the self may be expected as a result of these psychotherapeutic endeavors, and quite often these experiences are numinous. It is not worth the effort to try to describe their totality character. Anyone who has experienced anything of the sort will know what I mean, and anyone who has not had the experience will not be satisfied by any amount of descriptions. I can absolutely commiserate with that. Right? That feeling is definitely understood over here. Moreover, there are countless descriptions of it in world literature, but I know of no case in which the bare description conveyed the experience. That is because it is not a possibility, right? I can give you descriptions of the throne room experience. We have seen Doran's experience, right? Already described in here. That was what keyed me in on Doran to begin with. I can tell you what happened. I cannot give it to you, right? I can give you I can tell you my experience. I cannot give it to you. I say that a lot, right? I can relay the things that have happened to me. I cannot give you the experience of these things happening to me. There is no case where it will convey the experience. I've tried. Other people have tried. I'm currently rewriting this, right? We're doing second edition. I'm doing it mostly mentally. I got to reformulate a whole lot of things. Not that there's bad information. I've just got extra that needs to be added in the right way. There is no way that I can give you the experience. I can only relay it. And that is what I'm trying to say here, right? That is, I can tell you this has changed my life physically. I have been healed in 4 different ways. My throat, my shoulder, my back, and my leg. Right? That's not even taking in the fact that I no longer get depressed, right? I have issues. There's still bad things that happen in my life. I'm just able to alchemize them. I no longer face anxiety, right? Even though, right, I do not manifest wealth, right? We talk about that quite often. I manifest my highest purpose, and if my highest purpose leads to wealth, then that's gravy. If not, then I will be where I am. And where I am is pretty close to destitution, right? My bills are paid, but we don't have money for snacks. We don't have money for desserts. We have money to eat on. We are provided for, and I am thankful for that. I have healed myself physically and mentally, right? Despite the fact that I have like $10 in my bank account right now, right? I have just enough food to get us to payday. My bills are paid, but they are not necessarily paid on time. Right? I do not have anxiety over any of that. I believe that I will be provided for. I believe that the fruition of the plan will come to pass. I believe that all of these things will happen. I no longer feel anxious about them. I no longer feel depressive over the state of things, whether that is on an external, world, global scale or an internal one. I cannot give you that. I can relay to you that I no longer feel anxiety, but how can you even identify with that? If you have not been through the experience, you cannot even conceptualize that. What do you mean you don't get anxious over things that should be giving you anxiety? I mean, I have another assurance. I have a better understanding. I have the fullness of the plan coming to me. I can't give you that fact. I can just relay it to you. I cannot give you the experience. I can just give you the instructions is even a big word, right? I can show you the path that I have taken. And whether you take the exact same path or one that is similar to it or one that is completely different, that's not up to me. I can only relay the experience. Back to the text. I'm getting off on tangents. It is not in the least astonishing that numinous experiences should occur in the course of psychological treatment, and that they may even be expected with some regularity. For they also occur very frequently in exceptional psychic states that are not treated, and may even cause them. They do not belong exclusively to the domain of psychopathology, but can be observed in normal people as well. Naturally, modern ignorance of and prejudice against intimate psychic experiences dismissed them as psychic anomalies and put them in psychiatric pigeonholes without making the least attempt to understand them. But that neither gets rid of the fact of their occurrence nor explains it. Nor is it astonishing that in every attempt to gain an adequate understanding of the numinous experience, use must be made of certain parallel religious or metaphysical ideas, which have not only been associated with it from ancient times, but are constantly used to formulate and elucidate it. The consequence, however, is that any attempt at scientific explanation gets into the grotesque situation of being accused, in its turn of offering a metaphysical explanation. That is because there is no other way to explain it than metaphysically. There is no physical explanation for it. Science is going to take exception to that, but they believe in black holes, so I don't care. It is true that this possession of metaphysical truths and assumes that they posit or give valid expression to metaphysical facts corresponding to them. It seems to me at least highly improbable that when a man says, God, there must in a consequence exist a God such as he imagines, or that he necessarily speaks of a real being. That is kind of reiterating what I said before, right? You make assumptions about God. That does not mean that they are true, right? I firmly and fully believe in the one true God who exists both in and out of creation. He is in creation as the Spirit. He is out of creation as God. Those are the terms that I use to define the difference between those two, right? The infinite is God. The finite is the Spirit. That doesn't mean that that is true. It means that that is the operational framework which has worked for me in the process of enlightenment. That does not mean that it is necessarily true. I mean, just like you assuming that God looks like you because this reference material that is definitely not correct in a lot of ways told you that, that is an assumption based upon pride. There is something about pride in that very same book. I swear there is. That is an assumption that is being made. It is that simple. Nobody knows the infinite who is outside of creation. Nobody has ever looked him in the face, and I use him because that is the vernacular, not because he necessarily is male. Right? We have discussed that quite extensively as we have gone along, and this is a reiteration of the same thing from someone else. At any rate, he can never prove that there is something to correspond with this statement on the metaphysical side, just as it can never be proved to him that he is wrong. Thus, it is at best a question of non-liquid, and it seems to me advisable under these circumstances and in view of the limitations of human knowledge to assume from the start that our metaphysical concepts are simply anthropomorphic images, true, and opinions, true, which express transcendental facts, true, either not at all or only in a very hypothetical manner. That I don't necessarily agree with, right? I do believe that they are anthropomorphic images. I do. They are opinions. And I just said even my beliefs are opinions. But they do express transcendental facts, but not at all, or only in a very hypothetical manner. The reason why he believes that is because of the very same limitations that he just placed upon God, right? You didn't get the experience yourself, so therefore you assume that what is described very literally in the text that you referred to, you take for being hypothetical, because you were never able to bring it to completion. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. It just means that you weren't able to do it. Indeed, we know already from the physical world around us that in itself it does not necessarily agree in the least with the world as we perceive it. The physical world and the perceptual world are two very different things. That is true as well, right? The things that you believe shape the reality in which you exist. We just had, I hate to get political on this channel anymore, but we just had the most ridiculous expression of this, like the most ridiculous expression of this over this past weekend. I believe it was the 18th of October. We had a No Kings protest, right? Now, if you were unaware, there is a group of people that are firmly convinced that Donald Trump being elected as the designated representative by a majority of both the popular vote and the Electoral College is somehow setting himself up as a king, that he is becoming a dictator, even though there is no physical evidence of that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. That is this, right? The physical world is that this man is coming in there through an act of self-sacrifice. If you don't understand that, you are operating in a realm of unreality. He has sacrificed physically with himself, emotionally with all of the shit that he's got to deal with, right? He has sacrificed his wealth. He is worth less now than he was when he went into office. Right? All of these things are indisputable facts. They are things that are occurring, and he is doing nothing but taking the appropriate steps to make us an independent nation. He has thrown away power. And by that I mean he has designated others to take control of their things, right? He has given responsibility to the various departments of the government, but in addition to that, he has at every possible opportunity thrown back to the states the ability to govern themselves in a variety of ways. That is the exact opposite of dictatorial, right? That is the exact opposite of setting yourself up as a king. And yet, there are millions of people who believe that he is doing this. That is a complete difference between the physical world of provable things and the perceptual world of you living in your fantasy. That is not the only example. Examples can be made from either side of the political aisle. That just happens to be a very good example, right? I am a almost true independent. I lean conservative, but I am a very liberal conservative is how I view myself. For the most part, I think that you should be able to do you, boo. I tell you that all of the time. All right, back to the text. Knowing this, we have no encouragement whatever to think that our metaphysical picture of the world corresponds to the transcendental reality. Moreover, the statements made about the latter are so boundlessly varied that, with the best of intentions, we cannot know who is right. The denominational religions recognized this long ago, and in consequence each of them claims that it is the only true one. And, on top of this, that it is not merely a human truth, but the truth directly inspired and revealed by God. We're going to finish this paragraph and then get to it. Every theologian speaks simply of God, by which he intends it to be understood that his God is the God. There we go. But one speaks of the paradoxical God of the Old Testament, and another of the incarnate God of love, and a third of the God who has a heavenly bride, and so on, and each criticizes the other, but never himself. Boy, if that ain't the truth writ large, right? Now, we've talked before about the Gnostics and how defining the Gnostics as one belief system is stupid, right? It spanned thousands of years, thousands of miles, and thousands of people with diverse belief systems. Some of them were sex cults, some were sex denial cults. Both of those particular instances are prideful. The same problem exists in the church, right? You can't say Christianity. There is no real true definition of that. And even within Jesus died, was sacrificed, rose again, right? That is the foundation of most of Christianity. Even within that, there are a lot of variations. But outside of that, doctrinally, right? You have Pentecostal, you have Baptist. We'll use First Baptist, for instance. And what's another good one? We can use Episcopalian. There's a good one, right? The Episcopalians believe that a female can be a pastor. They believe in the Eucharist. They have rites and things that are not necessarily in accordance with the other religions. Baptism, or Baptists, believe that you have to be fully immersed in water in order to be saved, right? There's no redemption without sacrifice or without baptism. You have to do the proclamation of faith and all that. But on top of that, once Jesus has died for your sins, if you drink alcohol, he's got to die for you again. I know that's hyperbolic, but it's a sin, right? You are condemned to hell if you consume alcohol or dance with your wife. And I use that one from my own personal experience. When I got married in the First Baptist Church in Zachary, Louisiana, I was not allowed to dance with my wife. We had to go to a bar room to do that, right? It was doctrinally unsound. But if you go to a Pentecostal church, you will find people dancing in the aisles in celebration of God. There is a biblical commandment for that. This is three very wide, very disparate ways of looking at the exact same text. All three of them say that they derive from this text their doctrine. But it is completely different for all of them. There is a wide variety between them. And that is just hitting three of the denominations. There are hundreds of them. Every single one of them is firmly convinced that this is the only possible path. This is the only possible way. And they are all wrong. Nothing provides a better demonstration of the extreme uncertainty of metaphysical assertions than their diversity. That diversity is mainly due to misunderstandings of terminology throughout the ages, mostly due to secrecy. But it would be completely wrong to assume that they are altogether worthless. For in the end, it has to be explained why such assertions were made at all. There must be some reason for this. Somehow, men feel impelled to make transcendental statements. Why this should be so is a matter for dispute. We only know that in genuine cases, it is not a question of arbitrary inventions, but of involuntary numinous experiences which happen to a man and provide the basis for religious assertions and convictions. Therefore, at the source of the great confessional religions, as well of the smaller mystical movements, we find individual historical personalities whose lives were distinguished by numinous experiences. Numerous investigations of such experiences have convinced me that previously unconscious contents then break through into consciousness and overwhelm it in the same way as do the invasions of the unconscious in pathological cases accessible to psychiatric observation. Even Jesus, according to Mark 3:21, footnote 327. We have not done a footnote yet. And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, "He is beside himself." Even Jesus, according to Mark, appeared to his followers in the light. Man, I'm going to Mark 3:21. When his friends heard, I'm not pulling to mind this reference, and normally I'm fairly good at that. They went out and laid hold of him, for he said he is beside himself. And they're talking about Jesus. I need to fall back and check out that source material myself. I will almost certainly forget, but I need to do that. The significant difference, however, between merely pathological cases and inspired personalities is that sooner or later the latter finds an extensive following and can therefore transmit their effect down the centuries. The fact that the long-lasting effect exerted by the founders of the great religions is due quite as much to their overwhelming spiritual personality, their exemplary life, and their ethical self-commitment does not affect the present discussion. I'm going to say, as I have pointed out so very often before, it was not the overwhelming spiritual personality, the exemplary life, or the ethical self-commitment that spread Christianity. It was the sword. And then later, the gun. Personality is only one route of success, and there are, and always will be, genuine religious personalities to whom success is denied. One has only to think of Meister Eckhart's. I've heard the name, but I am unfamiliar with him. I am going to pop this out, but I'm not really going to look at it right now. But if they do meet with success, this only proves that the truth they utter hits on a consensus of opinion, that they are talking of something that is in the air, or is spoken from the heart for their followers too. This, as we know to our cost, applies to good and evil alike, to the true as well as to the untrue. If that was not true, we would not have hundreds of denominations of the one true religion. The wise man who is not heeded is counted a fool, and the fool who proclaims the general folly first and loudest passes for a prophet and furor. And sometimes it is luckily the other way around as well, or else mankind would have long since perished of stupidity. This is almost certainly a dig at the Führer, right? He came from the area, he lived through the time, and he was definitely not happy with the situation. The insane person, whose distinguishing mark is his mental sterility, expresses no truth, not only because he is not a personality, but because he meets with no consensus of opinion. But anyone who does has, to that extent, expressed the truth. In metaphysical matters, what is authoritative is true. Hence, metaphysical assertions are invariably bound up with an unusually strong claim to recognition and authority, because authority is for them the only possible proof of their truth, and by this proof they stand or fall. All metaphysical claims in this respect inevitably beg the question, as is obvious to any reasonable person in the case of the proofs of God. The claim to authority is naturally not in itself sufficient to establish a metaphysical truth. Its authority must also be backed by the equally vehement need of the multitude. As this need always arises from a condition of distress, any attempt at explanation will have to examine the psychic situation of those who allow themselves to be convinced by a metaphysical assertion. It will then turn out that the statements of the inspired personality have made conscious just those images and ideas which compensate the general psychic distress. These images and ideas were not thought up or invented by the inspired personality, but happened to him as experiences, and he became, as it were, their willing or unwilling victim. I was a willing one. A will transcending his consciousness seized hold of him, which he was quite unable to resist. Naturally enough, he feels this overwhelming power as divine. I have nothing against this word, but with the best will in the world, I cannot see that it proves the existence of a transcendent God. The problem is that Jung never submitted, right? There is a point of return or a point of release of self-will, of the need to return, right? Without that completing step, you do not get to the transcendent part. Jung never took that step, and so he never had the experience with the divine, and I hate that for him. Suppose a benevolent deity did in fact inspire a salutary truth. What about all those cases where a half-truth or an unholy nonsense was inspired or accepted by an eager following? This is the problem, right? This is one of those problems. And there is no reason to believe that God is benevolent. I know we like to think that. We like to believe that God is kind, that he is just, that he is fair, but where's the evidence for that? There is evidence that God is ambivalent. There is evidence that he is neutral. There is not evidence that he is good. There is not evidence that he is not. There is evidence that he has created us. Significant evidence for that. There is evidence that he has set all things in motion and that there is a plan and that that plan even is beneficial. But you have the choices. You get to walk away from the plan. You get to go in an opposite direction. You get to choose all kinds of things. That implies neutrality. And this is a fundamental assumption. In the exact same way that you are assuming that God looks like you. You assume that he is kind because you would like to receive kindness from God. That does not make it true. Here, the devil would be a better bet. The devil, it does not exist, right? There is no co-equal to God who is out there tempting you, right? There may be a tempter that may identify himself as the devil, but he is not co-equal to God. He is not a deity. There is only one deity. It exists outside of creation. Everything inside of creation is part of the creation. And so if there is an entity inside of the creation tempting you, it is a creation by the creator, not the creator itself. And this is the same problem, right? This is assuming that because God is good, there can't be temptation from the divine. But there's no reason to believe that. God created wrath as well as he created love. He created lust and chastity. He created you with genitalia. And there are people that will tell you to deny use of that genitalia. That is wrong, right? That is a temptation in the wrong direction. To never have sexual activities is not for almost anyone. There are a few people who are called that way. It is exceedingly vanishing percentages. There is a balance to be stricken, right? But God is the balance. He is both the positive and the negative, the masculine and the feminine, the creative and the destructive, the positive and the negative, the light and the dark. He is both. And again, he is just the vernacular. Even attributing to God the masculine is making an assumption. Here the devil would be a better bet. On the principle, omni malum ab homini, man himself. But this metaphysical either-or explanation is rather difficult to apply in practice because most inspirations fall between the two extremes. Yes, being neither wholly true nor wholly false. Instead, containing both. Color me surprised. In theory, therefore, they owe their existence to the cooperation of a good and bad power. We would also have to suppose a common plan of work aiming at an only tolerably good goal, so to speak, or make an assumption that one power bungles the handiwork of the other, or a third possibility, that man is capable of thwarting God's intention to inspire a perfect truth. The inspiration of a half-truth is, naturally, out of the question. That man is capable of thwarting God's intention to inspire a perfect truth. Fallback. We would also have to suppose a common plan of work aiming at an only tolerably good goal, so to speak, or to make an assumption that one power bungles the handiwork of the other, or a third possibility, that man is capable of thwarting God's intention to inspire perfect truth. The inspiration of a half-truth is naturally out of the question. With an almost demonic energy. You do, right? But it is not demonic. You have free will. There is a choice to be made about everything that unfolds in your life. One side of that is a positive response. One side of that is a negative response. When you are cut off in traffic, you get to respond. You can either get mad, start cussing the person and bringing death upon their head, or you can take it as a sign that you have been delayed for a specific reason, right? That is two completely different ways of looking at it, and both of them are in your choice, and there are other ways of looking at it as well, and those are within your choice. One of those leads to the best part of the plan for you. And if you make the other one, then you get a slightly less good plan. That is how it works. Right? You have free choice. You have free will. God is constantly adjusting the plan so that you get the best result if you take the appropriate action. But you get to choose to take the inappropriate action at any point in time. So you can, indeed, thwart God's intention to inspire perfect truth. That does not make you more powerful than God, but you are here for the experience. What, in any of these cases, would have happened to God's omnipotence? Just because you have power does not mean that you have to exercise it. God could have created us as simple animals. We could have existed in a garden eaten from trees. And then there could have been God's will that at some point we develop cognition. And from cognition we develop the ability to determine good from evil, separating us from the animals. That is entirely possible. Would any part of that deny God's omnipotence? Right? The omnipotence would have been if God had decided that we were going to stay in the garden forever, right? Then he never would have planted the tree. He never would have given us the option to be able to ascertain good from evil. He would have never given us the ability to see light and dark in that particular way. But he gave us the free will as a function of his omnipotence, right? Just because you have the power to do something does not mean that you have to do it. I have many weapons in this house. I am fully versed in the use and care of these weapons in martial abilities. I could, at any point in time, make the decision to do things, right? I have the capacity to be fairly omnipotent to a certain degree, right? I can go and make decisions about other people's lives if I so chose. I mean, that is what I'm getting at. That is a form of omnipotence, right? I could at any point in time take these weapons and go and use them. Not on the table. But I choose not to do so. I choose to let other people do stupid things, right? I choose to allow them to infringe upon my rights sometimes, right? That is a choice that I make using my omnipotence, right? I have the capacity to end lives. Guarantee that one. And so me choosing not to do that is choosing to not use my omnipotence. That is what God is doing as well. It's not that he can't. It's just that if he did force you into the decisions, then it's not really decisions, is it? It therefore seems to me, on the most conservative estimate, to be wiser not to drag the supreme metaphysical factor into our calculations. At all events, not at once, but more modestly, to make an unknown psychic or perhaps psychoid. 238. 238 is on the nature of psyche. Oh, we are done with footnotes. Oh, wrong button. Psychic or perhaps psychoid factor in the human realm responsible for the inspirations and such like happenings. This would make better allowance not only for the abyssal mixture of truth and error in the great majority of inspirations, but also for the numerous contradictions in Holy Writ. There are so very many contradictions in Holy Writ, right? Even the book of Genesis, the garden, right? The fall, the original sin, which I don't believe in. God created these people in the state of perfection with his omnipotence where they did not deny his will, right? And then he created this tree and he put it in the middle of the garden. And he told Adam, he said, don't eat from this tree, right? But there's a lot of problems with that. First off, how did God, the omnipotent, omnipresent, all-seeing, all-powerful, not know that man would eat from the tree? There's a fundamental problem right off the top. God didn't know that it would happen? Okay. On top of that, Eve never received the instructions not to eat from the tree from God. There is no reason to believe that Adam would have relayed those instructions to her. Again, problems, right? There was a significant amount of time between those before God created the helpmeet. And then, on top of that, what did they get from the tree? The ability to discern good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil. That was literally the fruit of the tree. And so if they had not the capacity to understand good and evil, then they had not the capacity to understand that eating from the tree as a contradiction to the command of God would be evil. All of that is a direct contradiction. That is part of the numerous contradictions in the Holy Writ. And all three of those is from the same part of the same story. That is a repeating pattern throughout the entire book. And if that is confusing to you, I have read it to you. Not in its entirety. We skip Psalms, we skip Proverbs, we skip some of the minor prophets. We hit all of the major prophets. We went through the entire history. We went into the New Testament and dealt with the Gospels and Revelation, but we skipped over all of the letters because Paul is no reference, and there's no need to review his work. And speaking of contradictions, the contradiction between Peter and Paul is a significant one. The psychoid aura that surrounds consciousness furnishes us with better and less controversial possibilities of explanation, and moreover can be investigated empirically. It presents a world of relatively autonomous images, including the manifold God images, which, whenever they appear, are called God by naive people, and because of their numinosity, the equivalent of autonomy, are taken to be such. The various religious denominations support this traditional viewpoint, and their respective theologians believe themselves inspired by God's word to be in a position to make valid statements about him. Such statements are always claimed to be final and indisputable. I remember some of those statements from the book of Exodus, right? There were some theologians, one in particular in the book of Exodus, who created a law, right? If that is confusing to you, you should go and see the conversation between Jethro and Moses. But this theological leader decided to make a law, and part of that law was good, and part of it was absolutely horrid, right? By absolutely horrid, I'm going to use my favorite example. If you are cold in the middle of winter and you forgot to pick up some firewood, and you go out and you start picking up sticks to keep you alive, and somebody sees you and it's the wrong day, they are supposed to, by the authority of God, beat you in the head with stones until you quit breathing. That is definitely something that was claimed. That was definitely something that was claimed to be final and indisputable. And it is antithetical to the understanding of God. God got pissed off at the first guy that hit somebody else in the head with a rock. What makes you think that he's going to tell you to do it to somebody else? Again, those contradictions, right? Shed no blood of man, but if you go and you kill this guy because he picks up sticks on the wrong day, perfectly fine. No problems whatsoever. That's not a contradiction at all, right? There's so many. The slightest deviation from the dominant assumption provokes an unabridgeable schism. One cannot and may not think about an object held to be indisputable. One can only assert it, and for this reason there can be no reconciliation between the divergent assertions. Thus, Christianity, the religion of brotherly love, offers the lamentable spectacle of one great and many small schisms, each faction helplessly caught in the toils of its own unique rightness. This is funny, and it is only a reference because of the control system that Jung came from. He sees the Catholic Church as the authority, right? And therefore, there is the Protestant Revolution, which is the Great Schism, and then there are the various manifestations of that schism, which is the small schisms, right? There are hundreds of denominations. That is one of those preconceived assertions, right? Well, the right one is the Catholic Church, and all the rest of them are wrong. We believe that we can make assertions about God, define him, form an opinion about him, differentiate him as the only true one amongst other gods. I do that. I do, but mine are more general, right? Mine is not God's telling you you can't drink. Mine's not God's not telling you you can't cuss or have sex or have permissions, right? Mine is that God created you for an experience, that you are to have the experience, but that experience is intrinsically reliant upon moderation in all that you do, right? And that seems to be through logical deductions, which I have outlined several times, but I don't know in any one particular video, right? That seems to be the purpose of life, right? To make the moderate decision. But I don't draw the hard lines, right? Even the things that I believe, I maintain quite often. Like, I stand firmly on all of the assertions that I made in this book, but I am willing to be corrected upon them, right? If I get a greater understanding, I will change them at any point in time. It has to be a greater understanding. It cannot be a reversion to a lesser understanding. That is me trying to not do this, right? I make these assertions, but that is with the caveat that I do not know. I assume, I guess, I deduce, but I do not know. Even with the knowledge of the things that I have experienced, that is not knowledge replicable. The realization might by this time be dawning that when we talk of God or gods, we are speaking of debatable images from the psychoid realm. The existence of a transcendental reality is indeed evident in itself, but it is uncommonly difficult for our consciousness to construct intellectual models which would give a graphic description of the reality we have perceived. Our hypotheses are uncertain and groping, and nothing offers us the assurance that they may ultimately prove correct. That the world, inside and outside ourselves, rests on a transcendental background is as certain as our own existence. But it is equally certain that the direct perception of the archetypal world inside us is just as doubtfully correct as that of the physical world outside us. If we are convinced that we know the ultimate truth concerning metaphysical things, this means nothing more than that archetypal images have taken possession of our powers of thought and feeling, so that these lose their quality as functions at our disposal. The loss shows itself in the fact that the object of perception then becomes absolute and indisputable, and surrounds itself with such an emotional taboo that anyone who presumes to reflect on it is automatically branded a heretic and blasphemer. Yes. If you have not casually perused through my comment section, and particularly in the Bible study, right, most people manage to keep it respectful. Some have not, right? And if you do not keep it respectful, then you don't get to stay up. But as long as you keep it respectful, you can stay up. And that, even respectful, you can call me a heretic. Many people do. You can call me a blasphemer. Many people do. I refer you to the source material so that you can get an understanding of where I come from. Again, I have read through the Bible. There is about 161 hours of me doing so. Again, not in its entirety because we read through the relevant parts. But I investigate the taboos, right? I express things that other people consider to be taboos. And the very first thing that happens, right? People will click on my Bible study thinking that it is going to be, for some reason, a conventional one. And then they are rapidly disabused of that notion. And the very first time that something pops up where I am not in accordance with their particular dogma, it is an emotional response that ensues, right? It is an automatic flaming of me, and I am fine with that, right? You can call me all of these names. I come from a better place. Automatically branded indeed. In all other matters, everyone would think it reasonable to submit to objective criticism the subjective image he has devised for himself of some object. We just talked about that, right? Submit to objective criticism the subjective image is me saying, I can be wrong. I can be corrected. I can come to a better understanding. All of that is this exactly. But in the face of possession or violent emotion, reason is abrogated. The numinous archetype proves on occasion to be the stronger because it can appeal to vital necessity. This is regularly the case when it compensates a situation of distress, which no amount of reasoning can abolish. We know that an archetype can break with shattering force into an individual human life and into the life of a nation. It is therefore not surprising that it is called God. But as men do not always find themselves in immediate situations of distress, or do not always feel them to be such, there are also calmer moments in which reflection is possible. If one then examines a state of possession, or an emotional seizure without prejudice, one will have to admit that the possession in itself yields nothing that would clearly and reliably characterize the nature of the possessing factor, although it is an essential part of the phenomenon that the possessed always feels compelled to make definite assertions. Truth and error lie so close together and often look so confusingly alike that nobody in his right senses could afford not to doubt the things that happen to him in his possessed state. 1 John 4:1 admonishes us. Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. Oh, I agree, fully and wholeheartedly. Many of them are recorded in the Holy Bible. This warning was uttered at a time when there was plenty of opportunity to observe exceptional psychic states, although as then we must think we possess sure criteria of distinction. The rightness of this conviction must nevertheless be called in question, for no human judgment can claim to be infallible. In view of this extremely uncertain situation, it seems to me very much more cautious and reasonable to take cognizance of the fact that there is not only a psychic, but also a psychoid unconscious, before presuming to pronounce metaphysical judgments which are incommensurable with human reason. There is no need to fear that the inner experience will thereby be deprived of its reality and vitality. No experience is prevented from happening by a somewhat more cautious and modest attitude. On the contrary, that a psychological approach to these matters draws man more into the center of the picture as the measure of all things cannot be denied. But this gives him a significance which is not without justification. The two great world religions, Buddhism and Christianity, have, each in his own way, accorded man a central place, and Christianity has stressed this tendency still further by the dogma that God became very man. No psychology in the world could vie with the dignity that God himself has accorded to him. I want to point out that now this would have to be different, right? If there were to be two great world religions, Buddhism would be there, Christianity would not. It would be Islam. Buddhism is populated by a significantly more populous amount of people than Christianity and Islam probably added together, and Islam outstrips Christianity by a wide margin as well. It is the second most predominant religion on the planet by a wide margin. Christianity is falling farther and farther down the fall the more we go along. That is going to bring us to the end of this. I didn't know if we would get to the epilogue or not. We'll try and do that in another one. It's only 3 pages, but there will probably be discussion, and we're already long. So that's going to bring us to the end of this discussion. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult concepts. I understand that I do hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. This is the end, right? We have the epilogue. There will be one more video. It will be bringing everything together, but this was the end. This was the entire study, with the exception of the epilogue. There was a lot of meat in this. I am very happy with the way that this study went. Some of it was a little bit longer than I would have liked, but it all played out exactly as it needed to. This is not one of those studies that's going to get a lot of eyes, right? There may be certain parts of it that people may pay attention to, but for the most part, most people are not going to go through this. A lot of the work that I do over here, most people are never going to see. I mean, not necessarily because I want it that way, but just because that's the way it's going to work out, right? I wish that everybody would see it. I wish that everybody, or I manifest that everybody would see it. That everybody would come to an understanding of themselves that allows them to come to the understanding that I have. Whether that happens or not is outside of my control. I do not get to decide who sees any of these videos. There have been a few of them that nobody has watched. I am not disappointed that they're up, right? I have given good information along the way. We have talked about some of the bad information. Jung's main problem is simply that he never achieved. He never committed. He never surrendered. He never got to the point where he actually had the experience. And I hate that for him. I hate that for Nietzsche. It was obvious from reading through Nietzsche that he had the same problem. It was a commitment issue, right? The submission is a commitment. When you get through this process, if you're here, you've probably been through it, but along the way, there is a point right about here where you're going to have to decide that it is okay to submit entirely to the will of God. Whether that means that you do not come back to your corporeal being. Whether that means that you lose every single thing that has been in your life that you hold dear. I have made that a commitment. Right? I have taken that step, and that has been what led me to where I am. Complete submissal to the betterment of humanity and to the pursuit of the best me, right? Do I fail along the way? Yeah, I do, right? I still smoke weed recreationally. I'm dealing with that, right? It is not something that I necessarily feel like I have to give up entirely. I just need to get control of it, right? I've smoked a lot for a long time. And I don't believe that there's anything intrinsically wrong with it, but when you have something like that, you should be in control of it. There's nothing wrong with taking a drink, but if your life is consumed by drinking, you've got a problem. There's nothing wrong with smoking weed. God gave it to you. You can smoke it unrefined. You just got to dry it out. It does not get more basic than that, right? All of the other substances require human input. You can literally just pick the plant and smoke it, right? There's nothing wrong with that intrinsically, but there is with a level of commitment. If you were waking up every morning and you're waking and baking and you stay stoned all day, that's a problem, right? That is what I'm dealing with. I no longer do that, but I still consume probably too much. It is something that I am working on balancing within myself. I do not claim to be perfect. I do claim to be striving for that, right? How that plays out, who knows? I will fail. Absolutely. Everybody fails along the way. The important part is to readjust, to get back up and to continue on. The submission part is intrinsic. There is no separation from it. If you do not take that step, you will not achieve. And I'm not telling you you have to. But if you are on this path and you wanted to be, then you have to, right? You are free to believe in any of the control systems. If you do, you're probably not this far along in the study, right? There is nothing that will separate you from my studies faster than clinging to to untruth. If you are holding on to that Bible, you're going to discover some things about it that you're not going to like. We're about to be diving into a much more extensive understanding of alchemy, right? We're doing the theatricum, or the theatrum chemicum of Britannica, which is the source material that he used for this, for the most part. I fully expect to step on a lot of toes along the way. Most of the definitions are not correct. We've already determined that. And so there will be a good deal of toe stepping coming along. My main point with this rambling wrap up is there is a level of commitment. Jung never got there. And if you want the fulfillment of this, then you have to do it, right? You have to make the decision that you are going to do your shadow work, that you are going to take the steps along the way, that you are going to realize things about yourself that you do not like and to change them about yourself intentionally. You are going to take more conscious control of your life. You're going to start listening to the right side of the suggestive voices. All of that, right? Let's go ahead and just finish it up. All right. So if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book, or reaching out to me through any of the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are, and this has been pittstake. Peace.